This man was one of the smartest criminals in history. On the day before Thanksgiving in 1971, a man with the name Dan Cooper boarded a flight from Portland to Seattle. But no one knew he had brought a bomb on board. After showing it to a flight attendant, he started making demands. He wanted $200,000, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck to refuel the plane in Seattle. The pilots informed ground control about the situation on board. After landing in Seattle, all his demands were met and he released all but the 2 pilots, a flight engineer, and a flight attendant. They took off again, and after locking the 4 people on board in the cockpit, he opened the rear door and jumped out with the money and 2 parachutes. He knew that if he asked for 4 parachutes, the authorities would assume that he was jumping out of the plane with hostages, and so they couldn't tamper with them. He boarded a Boeing 727 plane, knowing that it flew at low speeds without stalling. Dan Cooper was never apprehended, and the FBI suspended their investigation in 2016. This man almost ended the lives of 4 million people. During the Battle of Moscow in 1941, a man named Otto Skorzeny, a Nazi officer, was put in charge of a unit tasked with capturing several strategic targets in the city of Moscow, one of which was the sluice gates of the Moscow-Volga Canal. The canal was crucial to Hitler's evil plan for the city, and had the Nazis been successful in capturing the city, Hitler had instructed Skorzeny to open the sluice gates, flooding Moscow and turning it into an artificial lake, killing the 4 million people inside in the process. The Nazis lost the battle for Moscow in 1942, and Hitler's plan for Moscow was a failure. Skorzeny was hit in the back of the head by a stray piece of shrapnel towards the end of the battle and was immediately evacuated from the front lines. This man was behind some of the craziest scams in history. He literally sold the Brooklyn Bridge. George Parker was an American con artist who operated in the early 20th century, specializing in real estate scams. He gained notoriety for his audacious schemes involving famous landmarks in New York City. He would approach unsuspecting tourists or individuals looking to invest in real estate, posing as the owner of the Brooklyn Bridge. Parker claimed that the bridge was up for sale, convincing his victims that they could make a fortune by collecting tolls from pedestrians and vehicles crossing the bridge. Incredibly, he managed to sell the Brooklyn Bridge multiple times, duping numerous victims who often felt too ashamed to report the crime. He also attempted to sell Madison Square Garden, Grant's tomb, and the Statue of Liberty. In 1928, he was finally arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. This man scammed a whole nation and easily got away with it. His name was Clark Stanley, and he was the original snake oil salesman. Snake oil was introduced to America by Chinese immigrants brought in to build railroads, and it was a remedy to help ease the pain after a hard day of backbreaking labor. Soon, there was a huge demand for snake oil, but supply was limited, and so people made their own different versions of it. Clark Stanley was exceptionally good at marketing his product, employing actors to testify about his fake oil. By 1901, he became the largest snake oil salesman in the country, but eventually his scam was exposed by the FDA. It was discovered that his product didn't even contain any snake oil whatsoever. It was just mineral oil, beef fat, and some other ingredients mixed together and sold to gullible customers. He received a small $20 fine worth about $600 in today's money and was set free to go. And so, this man was wanted by the most notorious drug lord in history. Barry Seal was a pilot who smuggled drugs for Pablo Escobar, making around $500,000 per flight at his peak. After getting arrested and facing the possibility of 10 years in prison, he decided to cooperate with law enforcement and secretly became an informant for the DEA in exchange for a reduced sentence. The DEA wanted to gather evidence against Pablo Escobar, so they outfitted Barry's plane with cameras. They obtained photographs, including pictures of Nicaraguan soldiers loading drugs onto the plane, as well as a photo of Escobar himself handling cocaine. The revelation of the Nicaraguan government's involvement in drug smuggling was leaked to the press, and the cartel eventually discovered Barry's involvement. Barry's cooperation led to a reduced sentence of 5 years probation. But then the Medellin cartel placed a bounty on him, $500,000 for his death and $1 million for his capture. 3 weeks into probation, he was fatally shot. Escobar was never charged in the U.S. for Barry's death, but he was eventually killed by the police while evading capture a few years later. Was this Coca-Cola's biggest mistake ever? Let me explain. After Pepsi essentially copied Coca-Cola's product in 1893, Pepsi experienced some initial success. But then, the company faced serious struggles following the First World War and even went bankrupt on 2 separate occasions. This is where Coca-Cola comes into the picture. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, there were 3 attempts to sell Pepsi to Coca-Cola. However, Coca-Cola declined to purchase the company each time. Thanks to some clever marketing strategies, Pepsi was able to recover. Presently, Presently, PepsiCo is Coca-Cola's biggest competitor and generates over twice the revenue of Coca-Cola annually. But then, why did the founder of KFC sue his own company? Well, it all started in 1964 when Colonel Sanders sold KFC to a group of investors led by a man named John Brown for $2 million. Part of the deal was that the original KFC recipe remained unchanged. The new owners helped the company grow and opened many new locations. However, in 1971, John Brown sold the company to a giant food conglomerate who decided to change the original recipe. Colonel Sanders was so unhappy with the decision that he opened a competing restaurant, which led to KFC suing him. Sanders also sued KFC for allegedly misusing his image and promoting products he hadn't developed. Sanders demanded $122 million in damages, but eventually they settled and Sanders was paid $1 million.